Childhood experience. Before I begin, I need to give some background and history to set this story up. This story took place in 2010 when I was 15 years old. I was living with my parents in a rural northeastern Ohio neighborhood. It was a pretty safe one, too. The houses were maybe a quarter of a mile apart and surrounded by woods in all directions. We had a dog we'll call Spike, as well as a few parakeets, which are irrelevant to the story. It all started on a warm, early November day. I even remember the temperature of that week being in the 60s, which is very unlikely in that area. My parents had to go on a business trip, so I was left at home alone. Now this was shortly after daylight savings time had passed, so the sun set early in the western sky. I should also mention that my parents had bought me an old truck, which they used from time to time. I would spend countless hours working on it with my dad, even though I couldn't drive at the time. I would often imagine myself driving this truck with my buddies. The vehicle is no longer around because it broke down sometime in the early 2010s. Anyways, because the weather was so good, I decided to go and work on my truck after school. School ended around 2:45 for me, and I couldn't get done with homework for another 2 hours after that, so I didn't get out there until somewhere around 5 o'clock, at which point the sun had already sunken beneath the tall trees. Let me mention that our dog Spike was an indoor-outdoor dog, and would often accompany me while I was working in the garage. He was a German Shepherd/Lab mix, so he was very protective of me. Around 5, I finally got out there with Spike, and started working on things on the truck. Keep in mind, I left the garage door open a crack to let the cool autumn air in. I remember having to change the oil, and while I was in the middle of doing so, I heard Spike start growling very quietly. At the time, I figured that maybe he was just grunting. I continued with my work, and I was almost finished when suddenly I heard this scraping and grunting sound. Spike had fallen asleep, but this sound sent him shooting up from his sleeping place and flying towards the garage door barking madly, which was around the truck in front of me. I put down everything I was doing and rushed to the front. When I got there, I wanted to jump out of my skin. There was a blackish gray wolf-like creature trying to crawl underneath the cracked door. It struggled because of how its body was angled. Its arms and legs bent at weird angles, such that it struggled in a crawling position. At this point, Spike had bared his teeth and had put himself between me and this ungodly beast. For a moment, me and the thing made eye contact, and it felt like I was staring at it for hours, even though it was probably only a minute. The trance I was in was broken when I noticed that the beast had made a lot of progress in getting under the door. When I saw this, I grabbed Spike and we flew into the house, where I then shut and locked the door from the kitchen leading into the garage. I'll admit, Spike was a heavy boy, but the adrenaline rush that I had outweighed any obstacle in escaping from whatever I had witnessed. I wish that right now I could say that that was the end of my experience, but unfortunately, that's not how this one ends. Shortly after getting into the house and locking the door, I heard something big skitter across the garage cement floor and reach the door that I had just entered. Spike was barking even more ferociously now, and we soon began to hear scraping noises coming from the other side of the door. This really spooked me, and I immediately got away from the door and began checking the other doors and windows in the house to make sure that they were all locked. After I had checked the last window, I returned to the kitchen door, where Spike was still growling at the thing that was trying to break in. Me and Spike then bolted to my parents' bedroom, where I knew my parents kept a loaded pistol, and shut and locked the door. Spike wasn't barking now, but he was still growling menacingly. I don't know how, but I fell asleep clutching onto Spike. I was out for maybe only a few hours when I heard something coming from downstairs smash into what sounded like splintering wood. At this, my dog started barking and growling towards the locked door. At the same instant, I heard a large mass make its way upstairs as fast as possible. Spike had only let about 5 barks fly by the time it had made it to the door. This is when I thought that I would die, here alone in the house to this abomination. The creature slowly started working on trying to break down my parents' door. Thankfully, the doors to the bedrooms in the house were solid wood, so it would have taken a lot more effort than the one in the kitchen. I didn't panic this time and thought that I should call the police. I stuck my hand in my pocket, but my phone wasn't there. I had left it in the garage. After this, I looked for a home phone that my parents might have possibly left in their room. No dice. I was one doorway away from this creature, who was apparently very intent on getting to me and doing who knows what. I sat there awake with a growling Spike all night, listening to this thing scratch at the door. It felt like forever, but I finally saw the first rays of dawn starting to appear in the early morning sky. It was shortly after this that all of the scratching ended. I looked under the door and didn't see anyone. After an hour had passed, I decided that I was going to risk it and run to my neighbor's house with Spike. Of course, when I got there, I didn't tell them what had happened, because at that moment I was too terrified to say much other than I needed to use their phone. After talking to my parents, I went back to the house with Spike. I think that I had made some excuse up, like Spike had gone into this frenzy where he scratched and pounced on the doors and walls, as he was a pretty large dog. Thankfully, my parents believed me, and I didn't have to tell them the real story. After this incident, life moved on, and still, to this day, I haven't seen anything like it, nor have I heard of others having the same encounter. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope that you all have a creepy one. Creepy experience when I was younger. This incident happened to me a few years back, but it still freaks me out. I had been trying to contact my uncle with an ouija board because I had never met him before. Nothing had ever happened during these sessions, or so I thought. A few weeks went by, and while I was alone in my room, my door flung open after I had heard a very loud, audible knock. I can see if anyone is there outside my door because of the gap under it. However, I didn't see anyone and felt a very cold chill. To this day, I still believe it was my uncle trying to visit me. The Abandoned Villa. This story is about what happened to me and my friends a couple of years ago. So one weekend I decided to go out with my two best friends. We knew there was an abandoned villa within the center of the small town that was not far from where we lived. We passed by that villa so many hundreds of times to go to school, but we never had the guts to sneak in until that day. It was a Saturday afternoon. My friends and I had nothing to do, so I said, "Hey guys, maybe it's time for us to be grown-up men and sneak into that villa." At first they were a bit nervous, but after a couple of minutes of persuasion, I managed to convince them to follow me. We hopped onto the train, and then walked to the villa. Once we arrived in front of it, we had to find a way to get inside because the main gate was closed and marked with police ribbons. At first, we didn't really pay attention to it because we were joking around. Then one of my friends mentioned the fact that the gate was marked with lots and lots of tape, and we immediately stopped laughing. We thought that if there were police ribbons on the gate, it meant that either something bad had happened, or they were trying to keep the public away. We were a bit more scared now, but it still didn't stop us from going inside. So we started searching for an entrance, and at some point we managed to find a breach in one of the sides of the walls. We crossed that breach, and we arrived in the front yard of the property. You could see that nature had regained its rights because there were bushes, grass, trees, leaves, flowers, bushes, ivy, and some moss on the front side of the villa. As we made our way through the front yard, I stepped on a huge wood branch which I thought would make a useful weapon just in case we were in any danger. So I picked it up and gave it to one of my friends who was taller and had a bigger build than me and my other friend. We then stepped inside the building and immediately noticed how dilapidated the house was. A smell of mold and dust suddenly attacked our sinuses. The air was not healthy at all. We began looking around on the ground floor. There was nothing but a kitchen and a huge living room. Everything was moldy and rusty, at least for the few things left behind. Then as we were exploring, we noticed a small staircase leading downstairs. We hesitated, but after a couple of seconds, we went downstairs anyway. We arrived in a garage where the owners had left their car. The car was still there, but it was burnt. We later learned that someone had set it on fire. There were other rooms as well, but it was pitch black and we had no flashlight, so we didn't explore them. We then went back upstairs to the ground floor and into the hallway. There was a huge staircase with a red carpet on it, as you would see in a horror movie or in a Resident Evil game. The carpet was all dusty and ripped. After seeing that, we didn't dare go up the first floor, but the adrenaline made us go anyway. As we stepped onto the first floor, we noticed that there was a huge hole in the floor, so we had to be careful and avoid falling through it, otherwise our next destination would either be the hospital or the graveyard. We then started exploring every room. They were basically only bedrooms, and some of them had no furniture left inside of them, so it was hard to tell whether it was a bedroom or some other type of room. At some point we arrived in front of the last door of the floor. We tried to open it, but it was closed, so my friend, who I gave the wood branch to, had the brilliant idea to break down the door. It opened, and we stood there in shock. All we could see in the middle of the room was a bath, and nothing more. We slowly approached it, and what we saw sent chills down our spines. There was a dry red liquid like blood stuck at the bottom of it. We stood there like three idiots for at least 2 minutes before quietly leaving the room. At that point, every normal human being would have left the place immediately, but we didn't. We resumed exploring like the idiots we were back in the days. So we went to the second and last floor, where it was pitch black. The only light source we had was the matches that we carried in our pockets. We began progressing step by step in the dark, exploring room after room, just to see that they were all empty. We then arrived in a room that was lit by the light of the night. We stayed there for a couple of minutes, taking our time to set our minds back in place after what we saw earlier. When we felt a bit better, we started joking around again. That's when we all heard a loud bang. We immediately stopped laughing and started staring at each other. I could see the fear in my friends' eyes, and they could probably see it in mine as well, because I'm not gonna lie, I was terrified. None of us said a word for what felt like hours. Then one of my friends whispered, "Hey, maybe we should try to go slowly to the exit and get the heck out of here." We all agreed, and as we were going down the stairs leading to the first floor, we noticed something that froze our blood. The loud bang that we heard was in fact the door that my friend had broken down earlier, which closed violently by itself. We were so scared that we went from sneaky mode to panic mode and made a run for it to the exit. Once we finally got out, we kept running, and we didn't even realize it until we were all out of breath at least 500 meters away from the villa. We sat on a bench thinking about what we had just seen, but we couldn't find an explanation for any of this. One of my friends claimed that as we were on the stairs leading to the first floor, he saw a black figure through the small window located on top of the room's door he had broken earlier. We still don't know to this day who or what made us understand that we had to go away, but what we know is that we won't go back there again. Plus, the door closed by itself, but it was in the middle of summer vacation. The weather wasn't even windy. That's another disturbing detail. Then, a couple of months later, we learned that the villa had been burned down. Now hopefully there is nothing left of it, not even the thing that scared us.